This is a really good, the Lord has a really good word for you today. Did you know that you're a hero? Did you know that you're heroic? If you are here today, you are a hero. You are heroic. And we're going to learn that in today's message. We're following God's story, following the Israelites' story, and the Lord delivered them out of slavery, out of bondage, and for about 400 years now, they've been worshiping the Lord, but also worshiping the gods of the nations around them. In 400 years, they would not commit. In 400 years, out of 40 kings total in the two kingdoms, only 4 kings were committed to the Lord. So God was patient with the Israelites for roughly 400 years. And finally it's time for the Lord to discipline His children, His people. How many of you have ever been disciplined by your Holy Father? I have. I'm going to go turn this off. Sorry. You got it? Thanks, Luke. That's the devil trying to stop you from learning how it is that you're a hero. Now, ladies, I know that the feminine form of that word is heroine, but can you indulge me just to say hero so I don't have to say hero and heroine? Okay. Because I don't like to say heroine. And you know why. So now we're at this point in the story. God's going to discipline His children, His people, His nation, and they're going to be scattered throughout the earth, and many of them are going to be enslaved. They're going to endure servitude in the nation of Babylon, which is the world power at this time. I'm reading from your notes here. God eventually brought the judgment He said He would bring because the people and their leaders were ultimately sinful and refused to repent at the preaching of the prophets. Now, beginning with, Elijah was really the first prominent prophet, but the Lord has sent them prophets warning them. The Lord is telling you, change or He's going to bring discipline. Change or He's going to bring discipline. I don't know. I remember in our house, Dad was at work and it was hard for her to get us 3 boys to mind. She would try all kinds of different things, and I don't know, she would warn us over and over. And she just didn't have much luck with us 3 boys once we got to a certain age. But then what were the dreaded words, guys, when we were little from Mom? You know. Huh? Yeah, wait till your father gets home. She tried to warn us. But we wouldn't listen. We wouldn't change. And then, of course, once she said that, we just fall all over ourselves trying to obey. Tell her how great she was and this and that. Kind of like the Israelites. In 722 BC, God raised the mighty nation of Assyria, that's to the north, to bring destruction on His people in the north, the 10 northern tribes. Assyria destroyed Samaria, the northern capital, and killed many of the people. Still others were deported. This began the Jewish diaspora. And there's different ways you can pronounce that, but I'm pronouncing it the Western Kansas way. Diaspora, which means the scattering of Jews into cities all over the world. where they would continue to exist in Jewish ghettos. You've heard of ghettos? Did you know that term originated with the Jews? Yeah, that's where we get that word, ghetto. It originated with the Jews. When they were scattered all over the earth to different cities, they would take the Jews and put them in a certain section, and they would even put a fence around it. And the Jews had a curfew. They couldn't be outside that fence after a certain time. And if they were caught outside that fence, depending on the situation, the punishment could ultimately be imprisonment, just for being outside the fence after the curfew. But that's where we get the term ghettos. It started with the Jews. Continue to exist in Jewish ghettos, awaiting the good news that would be brought in the New Testament period by apostolic missionaries like Paul. They're waiting for the good news. They're waiting for Messiah to save them. Gentile peoples, that's anyone who's not Jewish. Gentile peoples were now resettled into Samaria to mingle with the Jewish rabble that had been allowed to remain in the land. They allowed some of the Jews to remain. So if I'm conquering a people, which ones am I going to take with me, and which ones am I going to leave behind if I'm taking them back to my country? I'm going to take the ones that are strong and able to do a lot of work with me, and I'm going to leave behind the less desirables, right? The ones that I don't see as useful. Is that making sense? Gentile peoples were now resettled into Samaria to mingle with the Jewish rabble that had been allowed to remain in the land. The intermarriage of these peoples would produce another race that came to be known as the Samaritans. Remember when Jesus spoke to the Samaritan woman at the well? The disciples thought he'd lost his mind because the Jews didn't associate with Samaritans. They were mixed. Not only that, they mixed with the rabble that had been left behind. They developed a hybrid religion and culture that was distinct from what emerged from the Jews that would resettle there after their time of trouble. The Samaritans would one day be hated by the Judeans to the south and would play a role both in the ministry of Jesus and the life of the early church. We've heard of the Good Samaritan. By the way, I don't know if I've said this yet, but where we get the term Jew is from the tribe of Judah. That's where we get the word Jew, from the tribe of Judah. Okay? So, it's time for the Lord to discipline His people. We are in 2 Kings chapter 17. 2 Kings chapter 17. I'm starting with verse 7. God has a really cool message for you today. Really cool message for you today. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. Secretly. Isn't what we do in secret who we really are? Jesus says, live in the light. Live in the light. That's one of the things that's difficult about being a true follower of Jesus, a true disciple. Living in the light. Living in the light. Having nothing secret. That's why secret societies are not of God. God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, requires that His people live in the light. Secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. Now remember, anytime you see high places, that's foreign idols that they've put up. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that provoked the Lord to anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers. Now, why are they called seers? Why are prophets sometimes called seers? Yeah. And God says in two different places, he says, only to Moses did I speak face to face. All other prophets, I reveal myself to them in dreams and visions. That's why they were called seers. Remember Joseph he could interpret the dream of the fat cows and the skinny cows. Okay. Through all his prophets and seers. Turn from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your fathers to obey and that I delivered to you through my servants, the prophets. Of course, they didn't listen. They were stiff-necked. I'm on verse 16 in 2 Kings chapter 17. They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 idols cast in the shape of calves. They never let go of those golden calves, started by Jeroboam, and an Asherah pole. They never let go of the Asherah poles. They bowed down, listen to this. They bowed down to all the starry hosts. We could talk for a long time about that. And they worshipped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. Yes. They're so depraved. It's time for God to discipline them. They practiced divination and sorcery and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left. The Lord sent Assyria, the nation of Assyria, to conquer the 10 tribes in the north. This is in early, about 722 BC. But Judah has been spared. All the 4 good kings were from Judah. So God has spared them for a time. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Therefore the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. Now, we're still in 2 Kings chapter 17, and I am now on verse 32. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 32. They worshiped the Lord, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate for them as priests in the shrines at the high places. So they worshiped the Lord, but they never let go of the gods of the nations around them. In other words, they never came out and made themselves separate from the world. They never committed fully to God. They worshiped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. Now don't be so hard on the Israelites, because that's happening today in the church. It's happening today in the church. We worship God. Now when I say we, I'm not talking about specific individuals. Collectively, we've become a church. Many of us, not all of us, many of us, we worship God until it becomes inconvenient. Until it becomes inconvenient. And then we start to rationalize. Well, that was thousands of years ago. The world's different now. Well, we're living under a different covenant. Does God change? Does right and wrong change? Is there absolute truth? That is something that is beginning to overtake our culture. If you took a poll out there, how high a percentage of people do you think would say that truth is relative? Someone take a guess. How high a percentage of people out there would say that truth is relative? It's about 75% say that truth is relative. Okay, so now, as we go down through this chapter, it talks about what they're doing. They're straddling the fence. They never will commit to the Lord. But they became so depraved that they even began to sacrifice their own babies in the fire. So the Lord really, they forced the Lord's hand. Have any of you ever forced the Lord's hand for Him to discipline you? I did. I have. I left Him no choice. I've been so far off the path in the past that I forced His hand. Your parents, you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes your children will force your hand. They'll go so far off the track that they'll force your hand. You have to act decisively. That's where we're at. That's where the Israelites are. I'm now in 2 Kings chapter 21, and we're going to talk about the sins of Manasseh. It's the sins of Manasseh that caused Judah to be deported, and the Israel nation is no longer. Now, you've all heard of the prophet Jeremiah. Well, I should probably never say all, but the prophet Jeremiah. The Lord sent Jeremiah to the people of Israel, and Jeremiah warned them for 23 years. For 23 years, Jeremiah was warning the Israelites. God's going to act. He's going to act. Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 8 through 11. This is before the people came and took them away. Therefore the Lord Almighty says this. This is Jeremiah talking to the people. Therefore the Lord Almighty says this. Because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Now God is calling Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, his servant. Nebuchadnezzar is a pagan. He does not believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why is God called Nebuchadnezzar his servant? Because God uses unbelievers to do His will. God will do whatever it takes. God will use whoever it takes when it comes to His children. My servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, declares the Lord, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations. I will completely destroy them and make them an object of horror and scorn and everlasting ruin. I will banish from them the sounds of joy and gladness, the voices of bride and bridegroom, the sound of millstones, and the light of the lamp. This whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. For 23 years, Jeremiah warned them, if you don't change, Babylon's going to come and you're going to be their servants for 70 years. And it comes true. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, comes and he conquers them. This is from your notes. While the two remaining tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, continued on for almost 200 years due to periodic revivals, the sins of the king of Judah, Manasseh, finally brought down the judgment of God on the south. In 605 BC, so the north was scattered in 722. In 605 BC, 150 15, 17 years later, God raised up the new world power Babylon to lay siege against Jerusalem and destroy it. Now Babylon, we need to remember this from now on. Babylon represents false religions. Babylon represents false religions. It's from the Tower of Babel is where false religions began on earth. Organized false religion. Whenever you see Babylon in the Bible, it symbolizes false religion. There were 3 waves of this defeat over the course of the next 20 years. The final blow came in 586 when Jerusalem was leveled and the temple destroyed, thus ending sacrifices to atone for sin. In each wave of defeat, more and more Jews were deported to Babylon, thus beginning Judah's period of captivity. Like Jezebel, Babylon will go down in biblical history as a type of corporate evil. In 2 Kings chapter 21, we learn about the sins of Manasseh. I'm starting with verse 2. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places. I'm going on down. He did what Ahab did. Bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshiped them. Do we have star worshipers today? Do you have people who bow down to the starry hosts today? People who worship the stars? He sacrificed his own son. After this, that they crossed the line. That was the limit. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced sorcery and divination, and consulted mediums and spiritists. This is psychics, people. Palm readers. Psychics. They're evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now we may see them as harmless. They're expensive. They're seen as evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, in 2 Kings chapter 25, it describes the fall of Jerusalem. 2 Kings chapter 25, the fall of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He laid siege to them. Verse 4, then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the 2 walls near the king's garden. Though the Babylonians were surrounding the city, they fled toward Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. You remember Jericho? That was the first great victory of the Israelites when they first crossed the Jordan. The first great victory of the Israelites when they first crossed the Jordan River was at Jericho. And look where the end comes. Same place. Pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. And we have the end of Jerusalem, at least for a time. Verse 10, the whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had gone over to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields. So again, they took the big strong people who could work in their land. They left behind the poor people to take care of the vineyards and the fields. And God's people The promised land, the land that God promised Abraham, that Abraham himself never got to see. Abraham was faithful to the Lord. He never got to see the promised land. Moses was faithful to the Lord. He never got to see the promised land. The promised land, the land that God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, none of them got to see the promised land. The people who lived in the promised land were so evil they couldn't stay. Now God's people are scattered all over the earth. But the majority of them are in Babylon. Remember, Babylon symbolizes false religion. We have to remember that for the future. So Judah went into captivity away from her land. Now, let's get to the good part. I know I struggled with the Old Testament for years, and I would read it and I would think, what does this have to do with me? How does this benefit me? And then I was taught how to read the Old Testament by two different ministers, two different great men of God. And they taught me how the Old Testament, it says in the Bible, the Old Testament, these people and events are there as examples for us. Okay? This is the living Word of God. The living Word of God. God would not command us to read this. God would not command us to follow this if all of it wasn't beneficial for all of us. If you are here today, you are a hero. You are heroic if you are here today. Let me explain. We read in 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 33, they worshiped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. The Lord Jesus, since He walked the earth, did He just accept anybody? Did He ask just anybody to be His disciples? He handpicked people to be His disciples. As a matter of fact, we have different occasions where people come to Jesus and they say, I want to follow you, Jesus. And then Jesus explains to them, well, this is what it means if you want to follow me. And then what do they say after they find out? Well, okay, never mind. And they leave. And then He went and chased them. Say, please, please, please follow me. No, He didn't, did He? After He told some of them, well, this is what it means to follow me, and they said, well, okay, I've changed my mind, He let them go. He didn't run after them, chasing them. He let them go. The Lord, starting with Abraham. Mr. Devins asked a really intelligent question a long time ago. Why does God identify Himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Why doesn't God identify Himself as the God of Noah? Why doesn't God identify Himself as the God of Adam? Why does He identify Himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Because it was Abraham who He called out. He called Abraham out of the world, out of Babylon, if you will, out of Egypt, if you will. Egypt is a type of the world. He called Abraham. Abraham was pagan. Abraham worshipped several gods, just like every other person on earth. God called Abraham out of the world to worship Him and only Him. And that's never changed. The Lord delivered His people out of Egypt. He called them out of Egypt and set them apart and took them to the promised land to worship Him and only Him. Not to rationalize, not to say, well, that was 2,000 years ago, it's different now. Jesus, when Jesus was a baby, Herod found out that the king was born. And he told him to kill all the boys that were 2 years old and younger. And so an angel told Joseph, take Jesus to Egypt. And that was to fulfill the scriptures, because God said, I will call my son out of Egypt. That's all of us. He's called us out of Egypt too. He's called us out of the world. His disciples, they left everything behind. They left their businesses behind. There was even a tax collector who was very wealthy, left it all behind, walked away from it, and followed Jesus. Remember, most of the people they weren't courageous enough. They didn't have enough courage to follow Jesus like you do. Jesus invites, when he calls you, if you are here, Jesus has called you. If you are in this building right now, Jesus has called you. And that means that he has invited you to be a hero, to be heroic. Because he sees courage in you. Because it takes courage to come out of the world and serve the Lord and only the Lord. It takes courage to come out of the world and not straddle the fence. And that is heroic. That is heroic. Here's why you're heroes. If Jesus has called you and invited you to follow him and only him, if he's called you out of the world, what he's done is he's called you to original experience. He's called you to live an original life. Most people live lives that they've seen lived before. Think about it. Most people live lives that they've seen lived before. If Jesus has called you out of the world, he's called you to live an original life, to live an original experience. Because if you're going to further God's kingdom, you have to be original. You have to show others that are still in the world that it can be done. You have to be a model of something else that they haven't seen. Original experience is very difficult. It takes a lot of courage. It takes heroes. If you are here, Jesus has called you, has invited you to be a hero. He sees courage in you because you will have to live a life that you haven't seen lived before. You'll have to depend on original experience. You'll have to depend on faith and your own courage. What does God tell Joshua? Be of good courage. What does God tell Gideon? Be of good courage. What does God tell Abraham? Be of good courage. That's what he's telling you. Be of good courage. Live an original life. Enter into original experience with the Lord. And show people of the world that it is possible. It is possible to live a life that you haven't seen lived before. Look at Abraham. Abraham had to live a life that he'd never seen lived before. He was in the world of original experience. It was only his faith in God. That's all he had. And everybody, as long as human beings exist, they will say that name, Abraham. Daniel, he had to live a life he'd never seen lived before. He was called by God into original experience. It's difficult. Original experience. To live an original life with faith in God is difficult. It takes much courage. Jesus, if you are here, Jesus has invited you to that. Because he sees courage in you. Can you believe that? Of all the people out there, he sees courage in you. He sees the heroic in you, or you would not be here right now. It takes courage to live a life that you have not seen lived before. The world and this is what the Israelites did. The Israelites told God, we want a king just like everybody else around us. They wanted to imitate everyone else around them. Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Jesus. Has anyone ever lived a life like Jesus? Has there ever been a life more original than Jesus' life? Has there ever been a life more courageous, more heroic? And Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Jesus. The people of the world are afraid to live a life of original experience because it's hard, it's difficult, it's scary. There's strength in numbers. If I'm out there and everybody else is doing it the same way I do, I'm comfortable. It's very comfortable. This is not an easy life. It's not easy to be heroic. But that's what Jesus has invited you to. That's what God invited the Israelites to, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. They could not let go of the world. It says many times they worshiped the Lord, but they also worshiped the gods of the nations that were around them. The nations that are around us are the United States. The gods of the United States will look a little bit different than the gods of Russia. That's a different culture. Is that making sense? It's a different culture. It's safe. It's very safe to blend in to the majority. It's very safe to blend into the majority. It takes a hero. It takes courage to live an original life, to imitate Paul as he imitates Christ, who lived the most original, the most heroic life we've ever seen. And that's what Jesus invites all of us to. And that's what we learn from this story and the Israelites being taken to Babylon, the land of false religion. The Tower of Babel is where organized false religion began. That's the message. That's why we read the Old Testament. It's examples. It's lessons for us to learn. We learn from other people's mistakes, hopefully, right? Unless you're like me and you got to make them all yourself. Right? I can say this with all confidence. With all confidence. I look at every face in here. Every face in here. Every face in here. And every one of you, Jesus sees something heroic in you. And I think that's pretty cool. And I choose to be friends with you. I choose to be friends with you.